We are at a turning point. The United States, the most powerful country in the world, the one that for decades took on the role of promoting democracy, is turning autocratic. The change may feel like it's come very suddenly, but the balance of power on the world stage has been quietly shifting for decades, enabling the rise of authoritarian leaders and the decline of liberalism as a guiding force. Economics, more than politics, has been the driving force. In this video, we'll unpack what we mean by the liberal world order, how the institutions created to sustain it ultimately undermined it, and why ballooning trade failed in its promise to spread democracy. Finally, we'll ask, what next? The seeds of what we mean by the liberal world order are in this document, the Atlantic Charter. It was signed in August 1941 by then US President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. It outlined a vision for how the world should look after World War II. At the time, the Nazis were in control of large parts of Europe and had begun their invasion of the Soviet Union. The world was on the brink of a major power shift, either towards authoritarianism or democracy. Knowing what side they were on, the two leaders agreed on some principles for how the world should look after the war ended. No country should seek territory beyond its borders, democracy should prevail, nations should trade freely, and hostile countries should disarm. One vision in particular, free trade, changed everything. The end of World War II gave rise to a number of new multilateral institutions. As well as the United Nations and NATO, major economic bodies like the World Bank, the IMF, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which later became the World Trade Organization, were founded, as was the European Coal and Steel Community, which laid the groundwork for what became the European Union. As the Cold War developed, the Soviet Union established its own institutions of economic influence, like Comecon, which coordinated centrally controlled trade between socialist countries. Then there was the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union's response to NATO. Together, these institutions were the world order, and they represented two distinct poles: the American-led democratic West on one side, and Soviet-led autocracies on the other.
It was a bipolar political world and a bipolar military world during the Cold War, but it really wasn't a bipolar economic world, because only the West was actually a free market, and economically it was just much, much bigger than the Eastern Bloc ever was.
That was Robin Harding, the FT's Asia editor. He wrote an interesting article looking at how the world order is changing. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the world for a time became unipolar. There was one big power, the United States of America, and crucially, the institutions it led. If you're under the age of about 70, you don't know a world without them. So what did these institutions do? In its early years, the World Bank offered loans that helped European countries rebuild after the war. Meanwhile, the IMF focused on stabilizing the financial system. Major currencies were pegged to the US dollar, which in turn was tied to gold. The idea was that currency stability would enhance international trade. Then there was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the body that since 1995 has been called the World Trade Organization. Its purpose was to enhance trade by removing business barriers and introducing common rules. The might of these three institutions has quite literally changed the world. Because the IMF, World Bank, and what became the WTO were effectively American-led, the dollar emerged as the world's dominant currency. This offered the United States two big advantages. First, it could borrow money more cheaply than other countries, which helped fuel growth. Second, because the dollar was so dominant in international trade, the United States could impose financial sanctions on other countries, giving it a policing role on the world stage. The global trade war that's currently unfolding is putting both of those advantages at risk. But we're going to get back to that later. What we want to look at is how these economic institutions shaped global power. In the decades after the war, international trade rose rapidly. The United States was by far the most important economy. By 1960, it represented around 40% of global GDP. European countries like West Germany and France were also doing quite well, but nowhere near as powerful. Meanwhile, hugely populous countries like China and India made up a tiny fraction of the global economy. In those few decades of growing trade after World War II, there was a general perception that life was getting better. People were living longer, the world was becoming more peaceful, and democracy was on the rise, especially following the collapse of the Soviet Union. For the US and its allies, this trend reinforced a core assumption: freer trade meant freer societies. This general idea continued to gain ground. In 1993, just 2 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, the European Union was formed. With its single market and later common currency, the idea was to make trade even more seamless. In the 1990s and early 2000s, trade continued to expand even faster than before. Hyper-globalization was taking hold. But something had changed.
What's changed since 1990 is that the US share of the global economy and the West, broadly defined, its share of the global economy has got much, much, much smaller.
The reason? China's growing might. As its economy opened up and grew, the country wanted a bigger role in world trade. And that meant joining the WTO. One of the motivations was prestige. For an emerging economy, being a member of a powerful international body offered credibility. Membership also conferred protection from unfair trade practices. In 2001, China's moment came. A year earlier, US President Bill Clinton gave an address on China's WTO entry at the Johns Hopkins University. Reading his words today is fascinating. Economically, he said, this agreement is the equivalent of a one-way street, requiring China to open its markets. All we have to do is maintain the present access which China enjoys. He went on to say, by joining the WTO, China is not simply agreeing to import more of our products, it's agreeing to import one of democracy's most cherished values, economic freedom, which he predicted would lead the people of China to demand a greater say. In other words, America believed that accepting China into the WTO meant exporting democracy to Beijing.
I think there was a basis to believe it would happen because it had happened everywhere else up until then. So if you looked at the cases of Japan or South Korea or Taiwan, those were all cases where democratization followed prosperity, particularly South Korea and Taiwan. And so it was quite logical, I think, to believe that China would go the same way.
Some 25 years later, we're in a position to say what happened. After joining the WTO, China's economy became really powerful, really fast. In fact, if you measure its GDP using something called purchasing power parity, it's already overtaken the United States. That measurement, purchasing power parity, is important because it removes the distorting effect of exchange rates. Things cost less in China, which makes it cheaper to build and provide services. But that doesn't mean that individual people are better off. GDP per capita is still significantly lower in China than in the United States.
We had for many years this, I would say, inconsistency of this strange situation where the largest exporter in the world used the dollar in its own trade. So again, to invoice and settle bilateral trade. In other words, trade between China and, I don't know, South Korea, China and Australia, China and other countries. That was, for the majority, like almost 100%, invoiced and settled in US dollars.
That was Paola Subacci, an international economist and professor of political economy at the University of Bologna. The point she's making is fundamental to this story. Here we have a country that, by some albeit limited measurements, is the biggest economy in the world, trading in a foreign currency as part of a system created in a radically different economic landscape. It all sounds, well, outdated. But what about that other idea, that more trade would lead to more democracy? In China's case, it hasn't worked out that way, at least not in recent times. Since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, term limits have been abolished. Xi's thoughts on socialism with Chinese characteristics have been enshrined in the constitution. State surveillance has increased and dissent has been repressed. All this taking place against a backdrop of rapid economic development. Remember that pie chart from 1960? Well, here's how the share of total GDP breaks down now. The US is still the biggest player, but China, driven by a huge growth in manufacturing, and the combined countries of the EU are not far behind. Meanwhile, according to a paper published in the American Economic Review, more than 1.5 million American manufacturing jobs were lost as a direct result of trade with China between 1990 and 2007. This at a time when both the share of middle-income earners was shrinking and wage increases were much greater among high earners than low and middle earners. Alongside those trends, America's health is declining. Life expectancy is going down, making it an outlier among other major economies. Tying all this solely to China's economic rise would be inaccurate and a total oversimplification. But these diverging trends do matter, because they challenge ideas about the relationship between democracy and prosperity. Shocks like the 2009 financial crisis and more recently the pandemic ignited debates about the perils of hyperglobalization. As trade became more volatile, populations within liberal democracies have begun challenging the status quo.
People aren't happy. Establishments are offering the same old solutions. People are getting sick of it, saying, well, you failed, we need something different.
In 2016, the same year that Trump was voted in for his first term, the people of Britain voted to leave the European Union. Those in favour of leaving spoke of sovereignty, likening the EU to a shackling force that was stifling British independence. And even among the EU's remaining members, some countries like Hungary have been rejecting liberal ideals, increasingly siding with Russia and the Trump administration, and holding up attempts to impose sanctions against Moscow. And that brings us to the crux of this story. Multilateral institutions are powerless if their members are divided. There's no better example of this than the World Trade Organization. For years, its members have been at odds over a number of issues, including China's continued designation as a developing country and the power structures within the organization. But it currently has no way of resolving disputes because the United States has blocked the appointment of judges to its top court. This is especially apparent right now as the world is engulfed in a trade war.
And what is quite strange and depressing, if you like, is the resounding silence of the WTO. The WTO should be saying, yeah, right, now we are all under these rules and it should be multilateralism at its best. That's not the case.
Alongside the weakening of the WTO and the growing questioning of the dollar as the world's default currency, we've also seen new multilateral, non-Western financial institutions spring up. In 2015, the New Development Bank, commonly known as the BRICS Bank, was established. A year later came the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, based in Beijing. These new multilateral lenders aim to offer an alternative to Western-led institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. And the AIIB in particular helps to cement China's influence by investing in infrastructure in the developing world as part of the giant Belt and Road Initiative. So the weakening of American hegemony was happening already. But the rise of Donald Trump marked a new chapter, America actively absolving itself of the duties it had self-imposed in the wake of World War II.
The role without responsibilities is Donald Trump. You still have the power because you're the biggest, but you're not really a hegemon if you're not acting in a hegemonic way. And the point is that the US is not big enough to do that anymore because China's not quite as big, but it's big enough that it's impossible for a single person to whip everyone into line.
The recent upheaval on the bond markets in response to Trump's tariffs is a case in point. Usually, in times of volatility, investors buy US government debt, seeing it as one of the safest bets for a reliable return. Not this time. Instead, the cost of American borrowing has risen, undermining one of the core privileges the post-World War II economic order afforded the United States. On paper, the chaos unleashed by Trump's tariffs is exactly when a multilateral institution would ordinarily step in. But without reform, it's an impossible task.
The reform, in a nutshell, should really give more weight and more voice to the large developing countries, in particular China. Now, what is the problem with those two institutions? I mean, the World Bank and the IMF. The main stakeholder, the main shareholder is the United States. And the United States has the right of veto.
And so we're in a stalemate, one which threatens to undermine the very principle upon which these institutions were founded. Remember that document we looked at the beginning, the Atlantic Charter, and its core principles, democracy, territorial integrity, the disarmament of hostile powers, and free trade? Today, we live in a world where democracy is in decline. According to a report by the University of Gothenburg, the share of the world's population living in autocracies has risen from half to almost 3/4 in just 20 years, with the authors declaring that liberal democracies have become the least common regime type in the world, representing a total of just 29 countries in 2024. On the question of territorial integrity, a war is once again raging in Europe after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, the United States under Trump has been threatening to take over Greenland and to make Canada the 51st state. And Europe, no longer able to rely on the United States, is rushing to rearm. The liberal international order, as it was initially conceived, appears to be dead.
Democracy is a lot of work. And that's the other thing, that is not magic. And the idea then, oh yeah, let's switch to an authoritarian regime so we don't have to fight all the time, discuss all the time, find compromises, because we all have different needs, and then we need to find a compromise, and it's good for everybody. Losing this is losing something that is very important and very precious. I don't want to end up to think that the last 80 years was an exception in our history.
In the last decades, we've gone from a bipolar to a unipolar and now a multipolar world, with regional groupings like the BRICS and ASEAN rising in importance. With global supply chains and the digital economy connecting the whole world, the boundaries between authoritarian and democratic regimes are becoming slippier. And crucially, the relationship between liberalism and prosperity is not as clear as it used to be. What is happening in the United States right now is shocking to many, and it should be. People are being illegally deported. Judges' orders are being ignored. Government departments and universities are being gutted. Media outlets are being silenced. Scientific consensus is being disregarded. Security protocols are not being adhered to. And the principles of free trade are unraveling. The cult of personality around Donald Trump has accelerated the move towards authoritarianism. But the cracks in the liberal world order have been apparent for years. If the post-war multilateral institutions are to live up to their founding purpose, they need to face reality. The world they were formed to serve no longer exists, and the ideals they represent are under serious threat.